On the night of October 4th, 1967, residents near a small fishing community on the southern coast of Nova Scotia reported seeing a group of lights descend toward the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, they did not initially report it as some sort of spaceship. They reported what they believed was an aircraft about to crash. A crash was never physically established, but the reports prompted a genuine search and rescue operation involving local fishermen, the RCMP, the Canadian Coast Guard, and eventually the Canadian military. However, no missing aircraft was ever actually identified, no wreckage was recovered, and the object described in the official correspondence remained unidentified. This is the Shag Harbour Incident, one of the most thoroughly documented UFO cases in Canadian history. At approximately 11:20 p.m., 17-year-old Lori Wickens was traveling along Highway 3 with one male friend and 3 young women. According to Wickens, the group noticed 4 orange or amber-colored lights in the sky. The lights appeared to flash in sequence and were descending at an angle toward the water. From their position, the witnesses could not clearly see a solid structure connecting the lights. What they could see looked serious enough that Wickens believed an aircraft was going down. The group reached a telephone booth, and Wickens contacted the RCMP detachment at Barrington Passage. He reported a possible plane crash in the waters near Shag Harbour. His was not the only report. Other residents in the area also contacted authorities about unusual lights and an apparent descent toward the ocean. These additional reports gave police reason to treat the situation as a genuine emergency rather than an isolated observation. When witnesses and RCMP officers assembled near the shoreline, a light could reportedly still be seen on near the surface of the water. Descriptions differ in some details, as eyewitness accounts often do, but the light has been described as yellow, orange, or pale white. Estimates of its distance, size, and precise position also vary. The consistent element is that a luminous object, or at least an area of light, appeared to remain visible offshore for several minutes before disappearing. That doesn't prove that a solid object was floating on the water. At night, especially over the ocean, judging the distance and position of a light can be extremely difficult. But to the people watching from the shore, it appeared that something had come down and remained on the surface. Believing that an aircraft might have crashed, the RCMP contacted the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. Local fishing vessels began moving toward the reported location, looking for wreckage and survivors. A Canadian Coast Guard search vessel was also dispatched. The fishermen found no aircraft, they found no bodies, luggage, or recognizable debris. Several participants did, however, report encountering a patch or trail of unusual yellowish foam on the surface. This foam became an important detail in later accounts of the incident, but the foam by itself cannot establish that an unidentified vehicle actually entered the water. Without a preserved sample or a laboratory analysis, its origin cannot now be determined. As the search continued, officials checked whether any commercial, private, or military aircraft were missing. No aircraft that could account for these reports was identified. What had begun as a possible aviation disaster was now an unexplained incident involving lights that appeared to descend toward the ocean. Messages were exchanged between the Rescue Coordination Center, military authorities in Halifax, and the Air Force's UFO reporting desk in Ottawa. A surviving Department of National Defense summary records the results of preliminary investigation. It states that the sightings had not been attributed to a flare, a float, an aircraft, or another known object. That wording is significant, but it must be interpreted carefully. It tells us that several immediate possibilities were considered and that officials had not identified the source of the reports. It does not necessarily mean that every possible conventional explanation was exhaustively investigated or permanently eliminated. The terminology used in the records is also important. Officials referred to the incident as a UFO report. In 1967, the term UFO did not automatically mean an extraterrestrial spacecraft. It meant that the reported object or phenomenon had not been identified, and that was it. But the term was not added years later by civilian researchers. It appears in the government correspondence produced while the investigation was actually underway. Military officials recommended an underwater search. 7 naval divers associated with the diving tender HMCS Granby were assigned to search the area. The operation continued until October 8th. The divers found no publicly acknowledged wreckage, debris, or physical evidence identifying what the witnesses had seen. The search was then discontinued. The official result was not the confirmation of an extraordinary craft. It was an unsuccessful search following a report of an unidentified object. That is where the firmly documented portion of the Shag Harbour incident largely ends. The case did not immediately become as internationally famous as Roswell or several other UFO stories. Much of its present reputation developed decades later. Beginning in the 90s, researcher Chris Stiles located government records, reviewed newspaper coverage, and interviewed surviving witnesses and former military personnel. He was later joined in the investigation by other researchers, including Don Ledger and Graham Sims. Their work preserved witness testimony and brought the surviving official record to wider public attention. It also uncovered a much more dramatic continuation of the story. Now, according to accounts collected years after the incident, the unidentified object did not remain near Shag Harbour. It allegedly traveled underwater toward the waters near Shelburne, approximately 40 to 50 kilometers away. Shelburne was significant during the Cold War because the area contained a submarine detection facility. Although associated publicly with oceanographic research, the installation supported military efforts to monitor underwater activity in the North Atlantic. Later witnesses claimed that an unidentified object was detected underwater near this facility. Some versions of this account state that the naval vessels monitored it and that a second object eventually arrived, and that the two objects remained underwater for several days. According to the most dramatic version, both objects eventually moved away from the area, surfaced, and departed through the air. Now, it's an extraordinary story. It's also much less securely documented than the initial Shag Harbour response. There's no publicly available contemporary military record that confirms that an object traveled underwater from Shag Harbour to Shelburne, nor do the available official records confirm that the sonar contact, the arrival of a second object, or the reported departure of the two craft. Much of the extended narrative comes from interviews conducted decades later after the event. Some sources remained anonymous, while others reportedly spoke only on the condition that their identities not be made public. Now, that does not automatically mean that their accounts were false. Former military personnel may have legitimate reasons to avoid public attention. However, retrospective and sometimes anonymous testimony cannot be treated as equivalent to documentation produced during the event itself. So for an accurate assessment, the Shag Harbour story must therefore be divided into two parts. The first is supported by contemporary records. Multiple witnesses reported descending lights. Police responded. A search and rescue operation was officially launched. No missing aircraft were identified. Naval divers searched the area, and no explanation was established. The second part, the alleged underwater journey to Shelburne, the sonar detection, the arrival of another object, and the eventual escape, is an important part of the later Shag Harbour narrative, but it remains unconfirmed by the publicly available official record. Now, several conventional explanations have been proposed. One possibility is a meteor or fireball descending beyond the horizon. A bright meteor can appear much closer than it actually is, particularly at night, when witnesses have only few reliable distance references. That might explain an apparent descent toward the ocean, but it does not easily explain reports of 4 lights flashing in sequence or a light remaining visible offshore, assuming those details were perceived accurately. Flares have also been suggested. Multiple flares can descend slowly, change apparent formation, and produce reflections over water. However, the preliminary military summary states that officials had not attributed the sighting to a flare. Now, the available documentation doesn't explain exactly how possible flare activity was checked, so the official wording should not be treated as proof that every conceivable flare source was eliminated. Another possibility is secret military equipment, a missile component, or some other Cold War technology. The historical setting makes this understandable, particularly given the submarine detection activity near Shelburne, but no released documents identifies a Canadian, American, or Soviet vehicle responsible for the Shag Harbour reports. Space debris or a Soviet reconnaissance spacecraft has also been proposed. An atmospheric re-entry can produce a line of bright fragments traveling across the sky and may appear to descend toward a distant horizon, but connecting a specific spacecraft to Shag Harbour would require compatible orbital information, timing, and trajectory data. No publicly available evidence currently makes that connection. A re-entry also would not by itself explain a persistent light on the water or the alleged underwater events. There is the possibility that several ordinary events became connected in the minds of witnesses and investigators. Distant lights, an astronomical event, reflections over the ocean, and naturally occurring foam might have been interpreted through the initial belief that an aircraft had crashed. This requires fewer extraordinary assumptions, but it remains hypothetical. It has not been demonstrated from the surviving evidence. Modern UAP investigations emphasize precise coordinates, synchronized timelines, radar info, photographs, sensor data, and a documented chain of custody for any physical material. Shag Harbour has very little of that. What it has instead is unusual for a case from this period: multiple civilian reports, police involvement, and an immediate emergency response, contemporary government correspondence, and a documented military search. Continued archival cataloging has made the relevant historical matter easier for the public to locate. In 2024, Library and Archives Canada assembled a dedicated research list concerning the incident and related Canadian UFO records. So what can we reasonably conclude? On October 4th, 1967, multiple people near Shag Harbour observed lights that they believed were connected to an aircraft descending into the ocean, and police took those reports seriously. Rescue crews searched for survivors, military divers searched for wreckage, and officials could not connect the incident to any noted missing aircraft, flares, boat, or another known object during their preliminary investigation. Nothing publicly recovered from the search resolved the mystery. Something unusual was reported, and those reports prompted a genuine and coordinated emergency response. But what produced the lights and whether a physical object entered the water remains unknown. Now, this conclusion is not as dramatic as declaring that an ET spacecraft crashed off the coast of Nova Scotia, but it is more accurate. And more than half a century later, it's the combination of those credible reports and all the official documentation that continues to make Shag Harbour one of Canada's most compelling UFO cases, especially in the current UAP climate, where you have talk of unidentified submersible objects, or USOs, that has become much more common in the UFO UAP space. We have a prominent researcher, Richard Dolan, who's now released 2 books. There's cataloging tons of these USO cases, and I believe he still has a 3rd book in that trilogy to come out. We have many former active members of the Navy in the US coming forward with video information, things like the Go Fast video, the infamous Tic Tac encounter with the Commander David Fravor. These events are all happening over open water, and the idea that they're entering and exit the ocean as some sort of transmedium craft that can seamlessly move between the sky and water is starting to seem like a fairly reasonable take. Now, I'm not equipped to go far down that rabbit hole in this video, but the idea of there being possible underwater bases, as crazy as that might sound, is starting to take a bit more shape now. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a USO situation. I just kind of wanted to make sure that you're aware that not every UFO or UAP encounter now necessarily is talking about a ship from another planet. There's lots of alternate theories nowadays, so it's worth looking a bit deeper into if that interests you. But yeah, I think that's about all I have for this one, everyone. Thank you so much for watching, or in this case, listening. Please tune in for my next video or podcast episode. If you like this audio-only format, please leave a comment and let me know. A like or a subscribe would really help. It's a brand new channel, so I'm trying to get it going. Hopefully the video quality improves as I go along as well. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. See you next time.